So welcome to Zoom a Scientist. I really appreciate everyone joining us today. It's been quite a week in our world here in the United States, so I'm so grateful for you all joining our learning community to spend some time today engaging with the topic of Lake Sturgeon research and hearing a little bit about the research this awesome Women in Science is doing here, Lisa, at our university. And so just to tell you a little bit about this series, if you're new to joining us, Zoom a Scientist is a series sponsored by Lake Champlain Sea Grant and the University of Vermont Extension, as well as SUNY Plattsburgh. And so for today's session, oh, thanks, Caroline. I actually had, it was the wrong link in there. Apologies about that. So for today's session, we are going to be talking about kind of science and research that's happening here in the Lake Champlain Basin. And myself and Caroline that are kind of behind the scenes here, we are education staffers here at Lake Champlain Sea Grant, so we will be moderating it. And our goal here at Lake Champlain Sea Grant is to increase awareness and knowledge of watershed issues throughout Vermont and in New York. So we kind of created this series as a COVID-19 response project to continue some of the in-person and place-based work that we do with students virtually. So just as a heads up, this is being live streamed to our YouTube channel. So if you're joining us via YouTube, you can go ahead and use the chat box there to engage with us. We will be checking that out. And then without further ado, let me introduce our awesome speaker for today's session. So today we have Lisa Izzo, who's a PhD candidate, and Lisa is a part of the Vermont Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at the University of Vermont. Her research focuses on movements and abundance of endangered lake sturgeon in Lake Champlain. Prior to coming to Vermont, Lisa went to Rutgers University for her undergraduate degree in marine sciences, and then to the University of Maine for her master's degree, where she studied movements and growth of endangered Atlantic salmon in the Penobscot River. So we are so excited to have Lisa here today sharing some of her research. I have a sneak peek at her PowerPoint, and she's got some really awesome graphics and some cool things she's going to show you. So I'm pretty excited. So for today's presentation, Lisa is going to talk about lake sturgeon. And so lake sturgeon were listed as an endangered species in Vermont in 1972. Over the last 20 years, there's been an increase in sightings of adult lake sturgeon in Lake Champlain. Currently, we don't know much about where they are or what they're doing as juveniles. Lisa Izzo will discuss how her research and the use of acoustic tagging is helpful in answering these questions about the habitats that lake sturgeon prefer and where they are in Lake Champlain at different times of the year. So welcome, Lisa. We'll give you a big round of virtual applause. We're so psyched to have you. I'll let you go ahead and take over our screen right now and start sharing.
All right. Great. Thanks, Ashley. So is everyone able to see my screen now?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So thank you. I'm really excited to be here to talk to you guys a little bit about lake sturgeon in Lake Champlain and kind of what we've been learning about them on my project over the past couple years. So to start off, you'll notice in my title that I referred to lake sturgeon as an ancient fish. And here I just have a couple of pictures of multiple different species of sturgeon that are found in North America. And we sometimes refer to sturgeon as ancient fish or prehistoric fish or dinosaur fish because they were actually around at the time of the dinosaurs. Sturgeon first appeared in the fossil record almost 200 million years ago. So most of these sturgeon you see pictured here spend part of their lives in freshwater and part of their lives in saltwater. They're kind of like salmon that they migrate between the ocean and rivers. So what makes lake sturgeon kind of unique in this group is that they're the only member of this family in North America that spends their entire life in freshwater. So as their name implies, they're found in lakes, but they're also found in large and small rivers throughout the central United States and Canada. And so this gray area is just depicting the range of lake sturgeon. And throughout most of this range, they're listed as either extirpated or locally extinct, threatened, or endangered. So there's been declines throughout the entire range of this species. Lake sturgeon are really well suited to feeding on the bottom. So what you'll see here in this picture, these whisker-like organs, we call these barbels. They're sensory organs. So as these fish are cruising along the bottom, they use these to sense for their prey. And then when they find something, they suck it up with this suction-like vacuum mouth. So they're really, really well suited to feeding on the bottom. And lake sturgeon are very, very large compared to a lot of the fish in Lake Champlain. Adult lake sturgeon are typically 3 to 6 feet long. The largest lake sturgeon ever caught was actually 8 feet, and that fish was caught in Lake Michigan. They also get to be really, really old compared to other fish. They can live to be over 50 years old. The oldest was actually estimated to be 154 years old, and that fish was caught in the Lake of the Woods in Canada. So these are pretty unique fish, specifically here to Lake Champlain. They're the largest fish in Lake Champlain, and they get to be the oldest of any of the species we have here in Vermont. So I want to talk a little bit about the life cycle of lake sturgeon, because I mentioned before they are the species that's moving between different areas. And this is really important to why we've seen these declines in this fish, both in Lake Champlain and throughout their range. So lake sturgeon, kind of as their name implies, spend a lot of time in lakes. They're there for most of the year, but a really important part of their life cycle is that in the spring, typically in April, May, or June, they'll come into the rivers to lay their eggs to spawn. So this is a picture actually not from the Lake Champlain Basin, but this is from one of the rivers in Wisconsin. And the reason that these guys come into the rivers in the spring to lay their eggs is because they're looking for these kind of big rock bouldery areas and fast water rapids that kind of keep this area clean. So they're looking for certain types of flow, certain bottom types, certain temperatures that are found in the rivers in the spring, and all of these conditions really optimize the survival of their eggs. So that's why it's really important that they come into the rivers every year to spawn. Here in Lake Champlain, lake sturgeon spawn in 4 different rivers. All of them are on the Vermont side of the lake. We have the Missisquoi River up north, the Lamoille, the Winooski right here close to Burlington, and then Otter Creek in the more southern part of the lake. So after spawning, the adults return to the lake, and they'll spend the rest of the summer, the fall, and the winter in the lake feeding and preparing for the next time they're going to spawn. So after a couple weeks, the eggs will hatch, and at that point, they're referred to as what we in fisheries biology call larvae. These larvae are pretty small. They start out being less than 1 inch long, and these guys will drift downstream. And the reason that they're drifting downstream is that they're looking for nice sandy habitat. Like I said before, lake sturgeon are bottom feeders, so they want to find this nice, soft, sandy habitat that they can look for prey that they can suction up with their mouths. So this is what lake sturgeon look like when they're young and in the rivers. And now you see we kind of look like what we think of as a typical lake sturgeon. They have more of this kind of sandy coloration when they're in the rivers. And then they also have these black marks on either side of the top of them, and these are what we call saddle marks. And these are typical of what these fish look like when they're in the rivers in the early couple months to the first couple years of their life. So after a couple months to a couple years, depending on the system, these young lake sturgeon will move out into the lake and join the rest of the population. And this is the point when they start to look more like an adult lake sturgeon. You'll see their coloration changes a little bit. They're eating and they're growing really quickly in this phase, but they're still less than 3 feet long. And so during this stage, this is what we refer to as a juvenile. And a juvenile is just a fish that's not able to reproduce yet. And something that's really unique about lake sturgeon compared to a lot of other fish species we have here in Lake Champlain is that they spend a really, really long time in this juvenile phase. It takes them 10 to 20 years typically before they can mature and are able to reproduce for the first time and go back into the rivers to lay eggs. So this allows them to spend a lot of time feeding and growing to get to that really large size, but it takes them a long time to do so. Whereas most fish are only juveniles for maybe 1 to 3 years. So then at some point they become adult sturgeon and the cycle starts all over again with these guys going back into the rivers to spawn. So this life cycle has been really important to lake sturgeon, but it has exposed them to some threats that have contributed to their decline across their range. So one of the big ones that's talked about a lot throughout a lot of the areas is the addition of dams on a lot of the spawning rivers. So this picture is from somewhere in the Great Lakes region. You'll see this dam built here, and the sturgeon are actually kind of stacked up, spawning right below it. So what we talked about before is that they're going into the rivers to look for this nice rocky area with this fast moving water. They're looking for this really good place to lay their eggs so their eggs survive. With dams being built on the rivers, a lot of sturgeon are being forced into these areas maybe that are less than ideal for their eggs. Maybe they can't lay as many, maybe there's the ones that they do lay don't survive as well. So this has been really harmful to a lot of lake sturgeon populations across their range. Another big contributor to the declines in lake sturgeon has been overfishing. So this is actually a picture of a lake sturgeon that was caught in the Lamoille River right here in Vermont in the early 1900s. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was actually a commercial fishery for lake sturgeon in Lake Champlain and its rivers. So this involved setting of these long nets that we call gill nets in parts of the lake, and they didn't take what you would think would be too many fish out of the system, but lake sturgeon, it takes them a long time to reproduce at first, so 10 to 20 years. And then each individual adult lake sturgeon doesn't spawn every year. Some females will only lay their eggs once every 4 to 9 years. So that's a big gap of time that they're not actually reproducing. And if they're caught at a point in their life where they're younger, they're not able to lay as many eggs throughout their lifetime. So that's really caused a big decline in these species throughout their range. And then the last thing that we think has played a role here in Lake Champlain is sea lamprey. So some of you may be familiar with these guys. Sometimes people call them vampire fish. They have this suction-like mouth with these rasping teeth, and they use that to attach to different fish. And these guys are parasitic, which means that they're sucking the bodily fluids out of some of these fish, and that's what they're feeding on. So all of these marks here, this was a lake sturgeon that was caught in Vermont in the early 2000s, I believe. And all of these marks are sea lamprey attachment points. So these fish, some of them that are really large, can withstand attacks from multiple sea lampreys over time, but these fish don't start out being this large. So those smaller juveniles, if they get attacked by one of these lamprey, there's the chance that they could die. So we think that this might have been a contributing factor to the decline we saw in lake sturgeon in Lake Champlain. So the combination of these three factors really led the population of lake sturgeon to decline a lot in the 1940s, 1950s. And lake sturgeon were listed as endangered in Vermont in 1972. And one of the big things that was done in Vermont to try to stop this decline was that fishing for Lake Sturgeon was closed in the late 1960s. So this includes those commercial fisheries that I talked about before, but this rule is still in place, and it also means that you cannot angle for Lake Sturgeon in Lake Champlain. So there's no recreational fishing allowed for Lake Sturgeon in Lake Champlain. We're really trying to minimize the amount that people handle them because we want this population to rebound and come back. So the work that I do that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, we need to get special training and special permits to work with these fish. So they were listed in the 70s, and now we've started to see more adult lake sturgeon in the system. Some of you may be thinking, well, 1972 was a really long time ago. Like, why don't we know more about what they're doing? Well, one of the things about lake sturgeon is restoring them is a really long-term process. After a lake sturgeon egg hatches, it's going to take 10 to 20 years for that individual to even reproduce again for the first time. So it takes a while for these fish to kind of recover to the point that we want them to. So we're starting to see more of them, and that's really exciting, but we have a lot of questions about what they're doing in Lake Champlain. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley and do a little poll question here.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa. All right, team, our first poll question. So this question is asking, how long are lake sturgeon in the juvenile stage? 1 year, 2 to 3 years, 5 to 10 years, or 10 to 20 years? We have answers rolling in here. Give you a couple more seconds. And so if you're not seeing the pop-up poll, if that didn't pop up for you, that's okay. Go ahead and just put your answer in the chat box. And if you're joining us on YouTube, just go ahead and put your answer right in the chat box there. All right, so let's see. So Lisa, it looks like unanimously people think 10 to 20 years. You've been listening.
Yep, that is the right answer. Great. Then that's really going to set up kind of the next thing that I'm going to talk about. We have this long juvenile period. So we know that lake sturgeon are endangered in Vermont. So what do we need to know about them to figure out how to protect them and how to restore their population? So one of the things that we're focusing on for our research is just simply, where are the lake sturgeon in Lake Champlain? And this comes back to habitat, and habitat is just the environmental area that an organism needs to live. So when we talk about fish habitat, there are a lot of different things we can think about. We can think about the type of bottom habitat. Like I said, sturgeon are bottom feeders, so they want an area that they can suction up food from the bottom. We think about depth a lot. Are they hanging out in shallow water, or are they in really deep water? Temperature is another thing that we think about when we think about habitat for fish. So that's kind of our driving question, just knowing where are the lake sturgeon in Lake Champlain, and if we can start narrowing in on what are some of these habitat factors that we think are important to them here. And we're also looking at, does this change in different seasons? Maybe the habitat that they use in the winter is different than what they're using in the summer. And then lastly, does this change as the sturgeon get older and larger? Lake sturgeon go from being the size of less than the size of your hand to up to 6 feet long. And so we would kind of expect that to some extent, the habitat that they're going to need at those different points of their life is going to be different. So this brings us to what I do. And so how do we figure out where the sturgeon are? Well, a lot of what we do on this project, I'd like to call searching for sturgeon. We spend a lot of time out in the field early on. We have different boats that we're using. We're using different types of equipment. We're using sonar. We're using acoustic tags, like I'll talk about in a little bit, or using different types of nets and hooks and lines. And throughout all of this sampling, what we kind of learned, which is what we expected, is that it's really hard to find lake sturgeon in Lake Champlain because there aren't very many of them. They are endangered. So we know there aren't very many. We know they're pretty hard to find. And specifically, the juveniles have been very hard to find in Lake Champlain. Before we started this project, it was very, very rare that there were any reports of lake sturgeon that were smaller in the system. So with that, kind of going in with that piece of information, we know that's going to be challenging to find these guys. How can we get the most information from the ones that we are able to find? So that brings us to the work that we do uses something called acoustic telemetry. And that's just kind of a fancy term saying that we use sound to track these guys. So we have one of our juvenile lake sturgeon. And what we do is we take one of these acoustic tags. The ones we use are the ones highlighted here in this circle. You'll see that they're less than the size of your hand, so they're pretty small. And we take one of these tags and we put them into the sturgeon. I'll talk about how we do that in a little bit. And each of these tags is emitting a series of pings every 1 to 3 minutes. And those pings tell us which fish it is. Each of these fish has an individual ID number. So then we put these listening devices into the lake, or acoustic receivers. These guys sit on, we sink them to the bottom, and we leave them there all year round. And these receivers are listening 24/7. So anytime one of our little lake sturgeon swims near one of our receivers, it records which sturgeon it was and the date and time that that fish was near the receiver. So then as the fish swims on, encounters another receiver, and we know that it was at the second receiver 2 hours later. So what this allows us to do is kind of reconstruct a track of where these fish have been over the year and see what kind of habitat is important to them. So how do we put the tags into these fish? Well, a part of my job is being a sturgeon surgeon. And I'm going to show a couple pictures here about the process of how we do that. This is one of our juvenile sturgeon. We put them upside down in a sling. Their head is underwater the whole time, so they're able to, we keep their gills underwater so they're able to breathe. And if you've ever watched Shark Week, they kind of talk about how they flip sharks over and they go into tonic immobility. So they're really calm. Sturgeon kind of do the same thing. And then we also do this thing, you'll see this is our technician, Michelle, her finger is in the sturgeon's mouth. Sturgeon don't have teeth. Obviously you couldn't do this with a shark. Sturgeon don't have teeth, so we're able to put the finger into their mouth, kind of rub the finger around over the top of their mouth, and it's kind of like a little sturgeon pacifier, we call it. So it really calms them down, and they almost go to sleep. So then we're able to do our surgery really quickly, less than a couple minutes. We make a tiny little incision here, and then we put our small little tag into these fish. And then just like if you were getting stitches, we take a small suture needle, do some surgical knots, stitch them back up, and then they're off and ready to go. And so then we release these fish back into the lake. This is one of my favorite parts, watching them swim away. And now they have this tag in it, and these tags that we're using, we can track these fish for over a year to about 3 years, depending on the size of the fish and the size of the tag. So then the last piece of what we do in the field is we go deploy these receivers. And then every 6 months we pull them up, we plug them into the computer, and we get something that looks kind of like this. So for each receiver, we see all the fish that it detected during that time when we detected them. So here we see that sturgeon 1 at 6:30 in the morning. We found it on the north receiver. And then a little later in the day, we see sturgeon 1 again at 11 a.m. on the south receiver. So we would know that fish moved from the north receiver to the south receiver over this period from about 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. And we do this with all of the fish that we have tagged. So that's kind of how we do what we do. And then I'll turn it back over to Ashley one more time for another poll question.
All right, great. Let's launch our second poll here. So this should be popping up for folks. And so poll 2 is asking, what do you think would be the hardest part of our job on this project? So searching for sturgeon, being a sturgeon surgeon, pulling out all the receivers on the lake and then getting them back to download the information, or other. And if you have another idea, you can pop it in the chat box and let us know what that other idea might be. And I will say Lisa's photos are making this look very easy. So there may be multiple answers for this. All right, so folks are thinking searching for sturgeon. Step 1 of this process is the hardest. What do you think, Lisa?
I think that is correct. And I think the people that have worked on this project would agree. We did a lot of days of sampling where we caught 0 sturgeon, but we were able to find some, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, what we've learned from the fish that we did find. So now I just have one other question to ask you guys.
All right, so, oh, this, okay, for a second I thought I launched the same poll. What do you think would be the most fun part of this job? Okay, boats are coming in. Our very first boat immediately was release the sturgeon and see them swimming away. I love that. Let's see. Getting all the information. We're kind of split right now between the crew here and what we think. I'll give it a couple more seconds. I think folks are having a hard time making a decision about what might be the most fun part of the job. All right, so it looks like I'm going to share these results. We're 50-50 on releasing sturgeon and seeing them swim away, and then getting all the information from the receivers back to see where the sturgeon have been. What's the most fun part for you, Lisa?
It's a close call, but I think for me, getting my favorite days are when we download all the receivers and I get to see where all the fish have been. But it is pretty cool to see them swim away. They're really beautiful fish. But it's my favorite part is seeing them in the lake where they belong. So
awesome.
Okay, so like I said, my favorite part is getting all the information from these receivers to see where the fish have been. So what have we learned over this project? So this here on the side of the screen is just a little animation that I've put together of 5 of our tagged fish from the study. So each color is going to be a different fish. And you'll see them kind of come in at different times. That's because we caught these fish on different days. So they kind of entered our study at different times. And you'll see down in the corner here, we're ticking through the different months of the year. And each of these is showing the movements of the fish in between those receivers that we have in the lake. So we only detect the fish when they're near one of our receivers. So if we don't have a receiver in the area, we don't know that a fish is there. So our receivers are kind of focused on this area up here. This is the Winooski River. You'll remember this is one of the rivers that sturgeon spawn in. So we were thinking that these juveniles will hang out a lot in this area that we call the Winooski River Delta, outside of what we call their natal river, or the river that they were born in. And what we learned from these receivers is you'll see, like right now, all of the fish are kind of grouped in the same area. In the summer, they tend to hang out in this region of the Winooski Delta. And you'll see sometimes that they're all in the same place. Sometimes they separate out and they're using different patches of the delta. And this is Burlington Bay down here. So Burlington's right around here. And what we saw is as the water got colder in January and February, we see them more in this area than this north part of the delta. So we're starting to see them separate out between the summer and the winter. So this only showed 5 of our fish throughout the entire duration of this project over 3 years. We were able to find 29 juvenile lake sturgeon. So we put tags in all those guys, and I'll just talk a little bit more about what we learned about them. And one of our main questions was, does this change in different seasons? So this is kind of what the bottom of Lake Champlain looks like in that Winooski River Delta area. We have this like shallow, sandy river delta. It starts out being pretty shallow for anyone who's familiar with this area and goes up to about 30 feet. And then we drop off, the bottom drops off on this slope here. And most of our receivers on this slope are anywhere from 60 to 80 feet deep in the water. So what we learned is that the juveniles like to hang out in shallow water in the summer, but come winter time, they actually move into the deeper water. So that's one interesting thing we learned, that there seems to be this difference between the depth of the water that they're using in these different seasons. Another question we were asking is, does this change as sturgeon get older and larger? Well, what we know from some work that Vermont Fish and Wildlife has done is that the adult sturgeon like to hang out in this shallow water in the wintertime. So we see that the adult sturgeon are using different habitat in the winter than the juveniles are. So this is an important thing to know, because we want to make sure that we understand what these fish are doing throughout their entire life cycle, not just when they're adults. So, and just to kind of wrap up, I want to talk about 3 of my favorite fish that we've tagged on this project. Over here we have Spike. Spike is a really important fish to us. We named him Spike. You'll see these kind of little bump looking things on him. Those are called scutes. Sturgeon don't have scales like most fish do, and these scutes are bony plates. Sometimes people refer to sturgeon as armor plated, that protect them. So when they're really small, lake sturgeon scutes are really, really sharp. And then over time, they kind of wear down. And so if you catch an adult lake sturgeon, you won't really see these really prominent sharp scutes on them. So we named this guy Spike because he was the smallest fish that we caught in this study. So he was really, really spiky and really sharp. And then over here we have Bernard and Morgan. These guys were caught about a week later, and all 3 of these guys were caught in the Winooski River. And this was a big deal because we spent a lot of time searching for sturgeon in the Winooski River over 2 years before we found these guys. Based on their size, they're about a little over a year old. So these are the smallest and the youngest fish that we caught on this project. And they're the only fish that we caught in the Winooski River. So we were really excited to see where these guys went. We caught them in the fall. And then in the winter, all 3 of them moved out into Lake Champlain to overwinter with the rest of the sturgeon. And that's kind of what we would expect. If you remember from the beginning, at some point, these young lake sturgeon do move out of the river and into the lake. But one of the things that we didn't quite expect was that these guys, come springtime, 2 of them actually moved back into the river again. And they spent some time in the river in the spring and into early summer. And then come later in the summer, all 3 of them moved back out into the lake again. And they spent the rest of the summer, the fall, and the next winter in the lake. So this was something that was really interesting that we learned in this system. One of the things about juvenile lake sturgeon is that they're not just hard to find here in Lake Champlain, they're hard to find pretty much anywhere that there are lake sturgeon. So we don't really know much about what lake sturgeon are doing for this juvenile period, this 10 to 20 years of their life. So this is something we didn't really expect them to do. We expected them to stay in the lake once they went to the lake. So we learned something new, which is a really exciting part of science, but we also got more questions. Why did they come back into the river in the summer, in the spring? What is important about the river at that time period? Why didn't they spend the winter in the river? So one of the kind of cool things about science, I think, is that every time you do some research, you learn some things, but then you also come up with more questions. And so then hopefully we'll be able to go out and answer these questions again, kind of on our next project. So just with that, that's just a little bit about what we've learned about lake sturgeon during the course of my PhD. And I just need to thank a lot of people. Searching for sturgeon was definitely the hardest part of this project, and we had a lot of people help us with that over the years. And it's been really great to work with such a great crew of people at UVM, with the Vermont Co-op unit. And we've also worked with some really great people at Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department who supports our research. So with that, I will turn it over to Ashley and open it up for questions.
Great, awesome. It is so crazy to think about the complex life cycle that these fish have, and to think about all of the different places where, as humans, we have kind of interjected and kind of disrupted that, but also to see that these fish are incredibly resilient and have somehow still maintained their, baseline populations in Lake Champlain. So Lisa, as we get ready to kick things off, I'm going to ask that participants right now, if you have questions for Lisa, please utilize that Q&A box. So pop some questions in there, and Caroline and I will moderate them. And then to get things started, Lisa, I'd love to ask for folks that are watching, especially our younger viewers, if you could chat a little bit about kind of how you found yourself in this place studying lake sturgeon. I mean, looking at this research, I think you'd be hard pressed to find people that wouldn't want to be involved, but can you tell us a little bit about your kind of trajectory and how you got to where you are, and any recommendations you might have for students that are interested in kind of this profession or field?
Sure, yeah. So I started my kind of movements into this career in actually marine science and marine biology. I really enjoyed learning about the ocean and the beach when I was a kid. And so then I went to Rutgers University to study marine science. And while I was there, I was able to take a lot of different courses, get involved in some different research experiences. Actually, my first real job in science was I was working on genetics of Prochlorococcus, which is the smallest photosynthetic organism in the open ocean. And I kind of worked my way through, I did some work on clams and oysters, but I decided that fisheries was really the thing that interested me the most. So I decided to go get my master's, and I found a position at the University of Maine working on Atlantic salmon, and how they move into the rivers and move around the dams in the system there. And then following that, I was lucky enough to find this position in Vermont working on lake sturgeon. So movement of fish is something that's really interesting to me. And I think it's really important to the way we think about how we manage fish and how we restore their populations. But I guess my main advice to any students listening would be to kind of keep your thoughts broad and open. I went from working on the smallest photosynthetic organism in the open ocean to the largest freshwater fish in Lake Champlain, and there were a lot of steps in between. So try out a lot of different things. You might find something that you like that you don't expect. So keep an open mind, I guess, would be my main piece of advice.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you so much for that. And let's see. Okay, so we have another question here in the chat box. This question is asking, so this attendee is interested in knowing if any of your fish were, I think they're asking, accidentally caught by recreational fishers, and how would that affect your results?
So as far as we know, we don't think that any of our fish were accidentally caught by recreational anglers. So if you just happened to see one of our lake sturgeon, you wouldn't be able to tell that they were tagged. They have no external marks on them. So I think that anyone that would accidentally catch them wouldn't know. In my mind, this shouldn't impact our results, because if anyone does accidentally catch one of these fish in Lake Champlain or the surrounding rivers, they're supposed to keep it in the water, get the hook out or cut the line as quickly as possible, and kind of let them go on their way. So we're really hoping that anglers are minimizing their impact on the fish if they do encounter them. So I don't think it would be impacting our study at this point.
Yeah, that's great. I know that I have seen the signs. You had one of them in your presentation, but on the Winooski, a lot of the places where, you know, fish are spawning, they're clearly marked by Fish and Wildlife that, you know, if you're catching a sturgeon, for folks that maybe are not aware of that. So I think that is incredibly helpful. Let's see, Caroline, do you want to take over the next question?
Yeah, sounds good. And I stopped sharing my screen just for a quick second because it was seeming to be odd with my internet connection. So I'll share again after we do the questions. So the next one in line is thanking you for a great presentation. And their question says, it might be a little bit out of the norm, but did you ever happen to find plastic in the fish's stomachs when you were catching them?
So we weren't actually looking in their stomachs. We haven't done any work with that. So not that we've noticed, but it's something that we wouldn't have encountered yet in our sampling. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I know that you guys were doing the surgery just to implant the acoustic tagging, not necessarily, like you said, doing it like other research where you might be aspirating and then having them show what's the contents of their stomachs are.
Correct, yeah.
Great. All right. I have a question, something that you didn't mention, but I'm curious about it because I know it's been a problem on other projects. So those acoustic receivers that you have in the water that are deployed throughout the throughout the seasons, I'm curious the impact that aquatic invasive species like the zebra mussel has had on that project, and if there's anything you could share with folks about kind of the challenges in that realm.
So we definitely notice zebra mussels when we pull up those receivers. The receiver mount is basically a big concrete block, a rope that the receiver is attached to, and then a buoy. And at some times of year in some locations, we get a ton of zebra mussels attaching to those receivers. We're not exactly sure the extent that it's affected our project specifically, but we have anecdotally noticed that if there are a lot of zebra mussels, what we think could happen is that buoy could actually sink. And the receiver would end up not floating, so it might not be listening as well as we want it to. So there are definitely areas of the lake that we work in that we see a lot of zebra mussels come up in the summer on those receivers. So each year we have to kind of clean them off and make sure they're okay. Some other projects, they put different types of coating on the receivers to prevent that from happening, because there is concern that it might make it harder to hear the fish if there's a lot of zebra mussels on it.
That's great. Thank you, Lisa. And then I have another question, and this question comes from, I was actually chatting with some students last week, and there were lots of questions about lamprey. But one question I have is, you talked about the kind of different feel that sturgeon have versus traditional scales. And I'm wondering if that plays a role in the selection of the lamprey. Is it less advantageous for them to attach to a sturgeon versus, I'm thinking like a lake trout? And I'm just curious if you kind of have any experience or anecdotal information on that.
So they have done a little bit of work on kind of attachment points of lamprey to sturgeon. And they think that the worst would be if a sea lamprey kind of attached to the bottom of a sturgeon. And basically it's just fleshy. There's no protection there. So that's one of the things that we think isn't quite ideal about lake sturgeon. Luckily, when they're really, really small, like Spike, the lamprey can't really get an attachment point because those scutes are really close together. But as the fish grows, the scutes kind of move further apart. So it gives more opportunity for the lamprey to attach. I don't know if there's been any work done on if they think lamprey prefer to attach to trout over sturgeon, but that is something that more people in the Great Lakes are thinking about, what impact lamprey might be having on sturgeon.
Yeah, that's great. That's fascinating to think about what it might be like from a lamprey perspective and what they might look like for a host. And it's interesting also to think about some of the adaptations that these younger sturgeon have to kind of protect them almost from from some of these the larger kind of predation factors. So I'm going to leave the Q&A box open right now, and I'm going to just quickly pop through a couple other items, Lisa, and then if folks have a little bit of time to pop questions and they have them, we'll kind of return to the Q&A. Does that sound okay?
Yep, that sounds
awesome.
Good.
Well, let's give Lisa another virtual round of applause. That was a phenomenal presentation. Those graphics, I feel like, were amazing at kind of explaining her research and what happens in the movement and life cycle of lake sturgeon. Before we end today's session, I want to make sure we have time to just discuss a couple quick things.
And actually, I want to jump in. Quickly. It looks like Elizabeth Lee from the Maritime Museum just included something in the chat box. Was an article. So just for those that are listening in, I have not had the chance to click on that link, but I'm sure that it's great information. So just more resources from other people in the chat.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you for seeing that. I don't have the chat open right now. Awesome. Okay, so we are going to have a quick feedback poll, and I'm going to launch that right now. So tell us how your experience was today. And you should be seeing that right now. If you don't see it, you can always provide some general feedback in the chat box. And then I'm going to give you a couple seconds here to start kind of sharing a little feedback with us. And then I want to talk to you about a take-home activity that I think is really in line with the project that Lisa just shared. So tell us what you think about today's session. And so I'm going to put a couple links in the chat box as well. And these links are going to be to a project that is similar to the project that Lisa just presented on, the Lake Sturgeon acoustic tagging. But this project is actually a marine project. They are tracking seals. And they are actually using satellite data to do this. And so this is kind of a cool project. I think if you are interested or you have students that are interested in this topic, this data set, it shows you the data and you can actually play with it and manipulate it and see how these seals have moved, and you can learn a little bit more about the project. And so I'm going to put a couple I'm popping them in the chat box right now, a couple links to that. And so one is the data set, and then one is kind of talking you through, it's a Science Friday resource talking you through this SEAL project and how it works. So I think there is tons of awesome stuff to learn in the realm of research and technology and how we can use that to gather high quality data. And so that project, this kind of take-home activity really looks at, what do we do with that data? Lisa said that's kind of her favorite part of the project, is actually getting to see where these lake sturgeon have been. And so this is kind of a cool way for you to play with some data that's out there and get a feel for that. And as always, if you're doing this project, working on it, share it with us on Instagram or on our Facebook page. We love to hear from you all. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you all for voting in the feedback poll. That's great information for us to have. And then, as always, we want to invite you to our next session. So we are getting down to the wire here on our live sessions. We have just a few left. Next week's session is a really cool session by a graduate student here at UVM, and she is studying streams and stream monitoring, and so why people volunteer. So this session will be next week, Tuesday. This is with Rachel Pearson, who's a Master's of Science candidate here at UVM. And she's going to talk about how do we know if streams are healthy? Volunteer stream monitoring collects data to help scientists and local decision makers determine the health of rivers and what factors might be impacting their condition. Learn what motivates stream monitors in parts of the United States, Canada, and New Zealand. Throughout this research study, it considers the impact and attachment to place and the reasons why people volunteer to monitor and the outcomes of participation in stream monitoring. So this is going to be a really cool session looking at if you've been to our sessions and thinking, how can I get involved or what can I do? Rachel's going to offer kind of some information on folks that are volunteering to monitor, so citizen scientists. So that should be an awesome session. I'm going to link the Sea Grant virtual learning page as well as our YouTube page so you can join us for that. And it doesn't look like anything is popping up in the Q&A right now. So if you have a question, get it in there fast. Otherwise, I think we will thank Lisa again for a phenomenal presentation. And thank you all for joining us today. And we will see you next week.